Well, hi there, folks. This is Ron Davis with the Jewish Road, and glad to have you back as we are studying and going through the life of Joseph. We are coming up to a time in Joseph's life that is once again going to be very interesting. We're going to be looking at chapter 40, and in chapter 40, we find Joseph in prison. We found him in prison at the end of chapter 39 when he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and he was dealing with temptation. This was a temptation from the enemy, really, but from God's vantage point, Joseph was being tested. You can't really know what is inside a person until he is tested, and Joseph is coming through all of these things with flying colors, and yet he is in a quandary because he is still finding himself in prison, and yet the last verse of chapter 39 tells us that the Lord was with Joseph. And so we head into chapter 40, and in chapter 40, we find him in some interesting scenarios here while he is in prison. And as I said, the Lord was with Joseph, and he is giving him success, and he's giving him, promotions, if you can call it that, while you're in prison, and, over and above all of the other inmates. But the problem is he's still in prison. So here we find Joseph, and in chapter 40, it tells us the story here of the cupbearer and the baker. They are also prisoners. They are thrown into prison because Pharaoh became angry with them. We don't know what they did, but he became angry with them. And what happens to them here in prison, it sets the stage for what is going to ultimately take place in the life of Joseph in the fulfillment of his dreams. Remember the dreams that he had all the way back in chapter 37. There are going to be more dreams, but for the immediate time, he's not having a great day. Things aren't going really well as we come into chapter 40. And really, as we look at this, this chapter is really all about being forgotten. And that's where we're going to ultimately find Joseph in this. But let's take a look at chapter 40 here. And in verse 1, it says, "Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined." So they are thrown into the prison right where Joseph was. In fact, Joseph has been in charge of everything because the Lord was with him, and the prison guard, the one who was in charge down there, actually put Joseph in charge, and then he didn't have to worry about anything. So the captain of the guard, now when these two are thrown in, the cupbearer and the baker, he appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended to them. They continued for some time in custody, it says. So here we have Joseph in prison, and now these other two are put in there, and Joseph is in charge of them. And look what happens next here. One night, they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in prison, each with his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. So here we are again with dreams. Dreams happened as we were introduced in the beginning of the life of Joseph in chapter 37 with his brothers and with the whole family. And, the dreams didn't exactly go well for him back then at that time. And so here we have another situation. We have dreams again. But, it seems like God is using these dreams in both of these situations, and there's going to be more dreams to come. Really, God is using this in His sovereignty, in His providence, in terms of taking not only Joseph but his covenant people to the place where God wants them. That's what providence is all about. Providence happens in every day of our lives, as I've said several times. And so just to repeat that definition again for us as we consider the life of Joseph and we look at God's providential hand, it is that continued exercise of God's grace and kindness by which in His wisdom and power He preserves and governs and is operative in all that comes to pass in the world and directs all things to their appointed end. Just think of that and then think of Joseph, because that is what is taking place in his life. And as a matter of fact, God's providence takes place in our lives every day as well, whether we realize it or not. If you are one of God's children, He is directing your paths to His appointed ends. And sometimes He uses those who are not His children to direct the paths of the world and all these things to the end that He wants to take them to. So back to chapter 40, we have the cupbearer and the baker, and they both have a dream, and each dream is individual, and each dream has its own interpretation. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast? Why are you looking so sad?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." And so Joseph is offering to them, saying, "Tell me the dreams. God can give the interpretation here." So the chief cupbearer is the first one, and he tells his dream to Joseph, and he says to him, this is what he says: "In my dream, there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." That was his dream. He didn't understand it. Joseph says to him, this is its interpretation. And of course, Joseph is receiving this from God. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. So good news for the cupbearer. Joseph gives an interpretation. He tells him in 3 days, you are going to be restored to your office. You're going to put that cup back into Pharaoh's hand. And, this is what is going to happen. But Joseph has a plea coming right after that. And it's interesting because, Joseph is troubled. He doesn't want to be down there in this prison. He doesn't feel like he deserves to be there. And this is what he says to the cupbearer. He says, after he gives this interpretation that the cupbearer is going to be taken out, he says, "Only remember me when it is well with you." In other words, when you get taken out of here, "and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. Get me out of this place. Get me out of here." He says, "For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. And so Joseph has a plea. He is pleading his case before the cupbearer and saying, "Get me out of here. I was stolen. I was taken out of my land, away from my family. I'm, that shouldn't have happened to me, and I shouldn't even be in here because I haven't done anything wrong." And so Joseph has, a little bit of a sense of, urgency with this, and he sees a little bit of daylight because he knows in 3 days the cupbearer is going to get out, and he says, "Remember me when you get out of here. Remember me and take me out of this place. Help me to get out of here." And so, good news for the cupbearer. Then there is the chief baker. Remember him? He was thrown into prison also. And when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable for the cupbearer, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream." And so he tells him his dream. He says, "There were these cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation." He says, "The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." Not good news for the baker. And so Joseph, is giving interpretations. One is good, one is not good. And what happened on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, it tells us, he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants, and he restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, just like Joseph said that he was going to do. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Now, this is the sad point of this story, because it says, remember, he asked the cupbearer, "Remember me when you get out of here. Put a word in for me. I don't belong here." And it says in verse 23, "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph and forgot him." This is an amazing story. Joseph is actually going to spend another 2 years down there in that prison. So he has spent a number of years, probably a total of about 13 years, he will have spent down in this prison. And he said, "Only keep me in mind when it goes well with you, and please do me a kindness, mentioning me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house." Uh, it's interesting. He says, "Remember me, show me kindness, mention me, and do what you can to get me out of this jail." It's kind of a little bit of desperation that we hear in Joseph's voice, the wording, coming across like an urgent plea, because he says, "I was kidnapped out of the land of the Hebrews. And even here, I haven't done anything wrong." And so the cupbearer totally forgets him. The main idea of all of this, what we have to know, is really about what it is about unjust suffering and the response of a person to unjust suffering. And there are a number of things that we should realize in our lives. One of them is that there is no guarantee against suffering. It's not a strange misfortune, and to regard suffering as being totally inconsistent with whatever following Jesus is all about. Following Yeshua is all about. So these things happen to us in our lives, and we need to realize that as these things happen, God will be working out his purposes if we will put our trust in him. Joseph didn't realize what God was doing, but he's going to realize when he gets down the road, because he's going to ultimately say to his brothers who started this whole thing, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And that is, a scenario that repeats itself throughout Jewish history. There are always those who have meant it for evil, but God is faithful to his promises, and we can trust God. And that's where we leave the story here with Joseph, because there's going to be another dream coming, and this is setting the stage. Joseph being in prison here is setting the stage for what is coming now, because Pharaoh is going to have a dream. And all of a sudden, the cupbearer is going to remember Joseph. He says, oh, yeah, there's a guy that was down there a couple of years ago. And we'll see what happens when all of that takes place in our next episode. And we will look at the life of Joseph as God is progressing him all through the circumstances and the trials and the tribulations in his life to his appointed end. So until next time, God bless, and look forward to seeing you again. We will pick it up in chapter 41.